In 1837, the Georgia State Asylum for the Insane received 2 albino children who would never leave its walls alive. The twins arrived on a bitter February morning, their pale skin almost translucent against the grey institutional uniforms hastily fitted to their small frames. Hospital records show they were admitted under the care of Dr. William Harris, the asylum's respected superintendent, who documented their unique physiological condition with what he termed scientific fascination. What those records don't reveal is that the children were not patients, they were specimens. By winter's end, both would be dead, their bodies dissected and preserved in jars that would disappear from the asylum's collection room decades later, along with any trace of their true identities. The Georgia State Asylum for the Insane stood like a monument to enlightened medicine on the outskirts of Savannah, its red brick facade and manicured grounds representing the pinnacle of 19th-century psychiatric care. Established in 1832 through the tireless advocacy of reformer Dorothy Hughes, the institution had quickly gained national recognition for its humane treatment of the mentally afflicted. Unlike the squalid conditions that plagued similar facilities across the South, the Georgia Asylum boasted spacious wards, trained attendants, and a philosophy grounded in moral treatment rather than restraint and punishment. Dr. William Harris had assumed the role of superintendent in 1835, bringing with him credentials that impressed even the most skeptical observers. A graduate of Harvard Medical School and former pupil of the renowned Dr. Samuel Warren, Harris had spent 3 years studying the latest European methods of psychiatric treatment. His published papers on the moral management of insanity had earned him invitations to lecture at medical colleges throughout the Northeast. When he arrived in Savannah, local newspapers praised his appointment as a coup for Georgia's reputation in the medical sciences. The asylum's board of trustees, comprised of Savannah's most prominent citizens, took great pride in their institution's progressive approach. Board meetings, meticulously recorded in ledgers that survived well into the 20th century, reveal their satisfaction with Harris's management. Mortality rates had dropped significantly under his care, and visiting physicians from Charleston, Atlanta, and even as far as Baltimore came to observe his methods. The Georgia Medical Society elected Harris as their president in 1836, cementing his status as one of the South's leading alienists. Behind the polished public image, however, the asylum harbored a darker purpose. Harris's true passion lay not in curing madness, but in understanding the physical manifestations of human abnormality. His private correspondence with colleagues at Northern medical schools, discovered in 1923 during renovation of the hospital's administrative building, revealed his growing obsession with what he termed physiological curiosities. He wrote extensively about his desire to study albinism, hydrocephalus, and other conditions that he believed held keys to understanding the fundamental nature of human development. The asylum's location proved ideal for Harris's clandestine research. Situated 15 miles from Savannah proper, the facility operated with minimal oversight from state authorities. The Board of Trustees, composed primarily of wealthy plantation owners and merchants, visited only for quarterly meetings and ceremonial functions. Day-to-day operations fell entirely under Harris's control, allowing him to pursue his interest without scrutiny. The isolation also meant that unusual sounds or activities within the asylum walls rarely attracted attention from the outside world. Harris had carefully cultivated relationships with local authorities who might otherwise question his methods. Sheriff John Thompson, whose own brother had been successfully treated at the asylum for melancholia, became one of Harris's most vocal supporters. The sheriff's monthly reports to the state legislature consistently praised the asylum's operations, describing it as a model facility that brought honor to Georgia's commitment to caring for its most vulnerable citizens. These reports, preserved in the state archives, make no mention of the special ward that Harris had constructed in the asylum's basement. The basement ward, accessible only through a narrow staircase behind Harris's private office, contained 6 cells designed not for patients but for subjects. Unlike the comfortable rooms on the main floors, these cells were stark chambers with stone walls and minimal furnishings. Harris had justified their construction to the board as isolation quarters for violent patients, though no violent incidents had ever been recorded at the asylum. The cells were equipped with observation windows and detailed recording equipment, suggesting their true purpose from the beginning. Ruth Palmer, who served as the asylum's head nurse from 1835 to 1838, possessed a unique combination of medical training and moral conscience that would prove crucial to documenting Harris's crimes. Palmer had received her nursing education at Philadelphia General Hospital, where she had been trained to maintain detailed patient records. Her meticulous nature, combined with her growing horror at what she witnessed, compelled her to keep secret diaries documenting the asylum's activities. These writings, hidden in her private quarters and later sewn into the lining of her trunk, would provide the only contemporary record of Harris's experiments. Palmer's diaries describe Harris as a man driven by an insatiable curiosity about human abnormality, but one who had gradually lost all sense of medical ethics. She noted that Harris would often spend entire nights in the basement ward, emerging only for meals and board meetings. She wrote of disturbing sounds echoing through the building's ventilation system, and of Harris's frequent requests for unusual medical supplies that seemed to have no connection to standard psychiatric treatment. Most importantly, Palmer began documenting these observations with the deliberate intention of creating evidence, sensing that Harris's activities would eventually need to be exposed. The asylum's medical staff consisted of 3 physicians besides Harris, all of whom appeared to share his unconventional interests. Dr. Charles Baker, Harris's second-in-command, had been dismissed from his previous position at a Philadelphia hospital under circumstances that remain unclear. Dr. Edward Collins, the asylum surgeon, had trained in Edinburgh, but left Scotland abruptly in 1833 following what his colleagues described as a professional disagreement. The third physician, Dr. George Mitchell, was a recent graduate of the Medical College of Georgia, who had sought out Harris specifically after reading his published work on physiological abnormalities. Together, these 4 men formed what Harris privately called his research circle, dedicated to advancing medical knowledge through direct observation and experimentation. Their correspondence reveals a shared belief that traditional medical ethics were obstacles to scientific progress, and that society's most vulnerable members could serve a higher purpose by contributing to medical understanding. They viewed themselves as pioneers pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, justified in their methods by the potential benefits to future generations. The asylum's financial records, maintained with meticulous precision, show regular payments to individuals described only as specimen providers. These payments, typically ranging from $5 to $20, appeared monthly throughout Harris's tenure. The identity of these providers remains unknown, though Palmer's diaries suggest they were individuals who brought Harris subjects for his research. She describes seeing rough men arriving at the asylum after dark, carrying bundles or leading children who never appeared in the official patient records. By 1837, the Georgia State Asylum for the Insane had achieved a reputation that extended far beyond the boundaries of Georgia. Medical journals praised its innovative treatments, and politicians pointed to it as evidence of the state's commitment to progressive social policies. Behind this facade of respectability, however, Harris and his colleagues had created something far more sinister, a laboratory for human experimentation hidden within the walls of a respected institution. The arrival of the Albino twins in February 1837 would mark the beginning of the asylum's most horrific chapter, though the full extent of their crimes would not be revealed for decades. The twins' arrival had been preceded by months of preparation. Harris had received word through his network of specimen providers that 2 albino children, believed to be siblings, were being held at a foundling home in rural Georgia. The children, whose names were recorded only as Subject A and Subject B in Harris's private notes, represented the perfect opportunity for his research into the physiological basis of albinism. Harris had spent considerable time studying the condition through medical texts, but had never had the opportunity to observe living subjects. The twins would provide him with that opportunity, though the cost of his research would prove to be their lives. Ruth Palmer's decision to document Harris's activities in secret proved prescient. Her diaries from this period show her growing awareness that she was witnessing unprecedented medical crimes, and her determination to create a record that might someday bring Harris to justice. Palmer understood the risks she was taking, noting in her entries that discovery would mean not only dismissal, but potentially criminal charges as an accomplice. Nevertheless, her moral conviction compelled her to continue recording the details of Harris's experiments, creating what would become the only contemporary documentation of the twins' suffering. The first indication that something was amiss at the Georgia State Asylum came from an unexpected source: a delivery boy named Frank Reynolds, who regularly brought supplies to the institution. Reynolds, barely 16 and employed by Henderson & Sons General Merchandise, had been making weekly deliveries to the asylum for nearly 2 years. His route typically took him through the main entrance, where he would deposit his cargo with the receiving clerk before departing. In March 1837, however, Reynolds began reporting hearing what he described as sounds like children crying in pain, coming from somewhere beneath the main building. Reynolds initially dismissed the sounds as his imagination, but they persisted during subsequent visits and grew more disturbing. He described the cries as distinctly different from the usual patient sounds that echoed through the asylum's corridors. These were not the incoherent utterances of the mentally ill, but the specific wails of children in physical distress. The sounds seemed to come from below the building's main floor, emanating through ventilation grates during the warmer months when windows were opened. When Reynolds mentioned his observations to his employer, Thomas Lambert, Lambert advised him to mind his own business and continue his deliveries without comment. The merchant, who held a lucrative contract with the asylum, had no interest in jeopardizing his relationship with Dr. Harris over what he termed the boy's overactive imagination. A more significant warning came from Dr. Joseph Carter, a visiting physician from the Medical College of South Carolina, who had come to observe Harris's treatment methods in April 1837. Carter, who had been invited to spend a week at the asylum, wrote extensively about his experience in a letter to his colleague, Dr. Richard Coleman. The letter, preserved in the Coleman family papers and discovered in 1961, describes Carter's growing unease with what he witnessed during his visit. Carter noted that Harris seemed particularly secretive about certain areas of the asylum, deflecting questions about the basement facilities and insisting that some patients were too dangerous for visitors to observe. When Carter requested a complete tour of the institution, Harris claimed that renovation work made several areas inaccessible. Carter found this explanation unsatisfactory, noting that he had seen no evidence of construction during his stay. More troubling was Harris's apparent obsession with what he termed physiological anomalies, a topic that dominated their conversations despite Carter's attempts to steer discussions toward conventional psychiatric treatment. On his final night at the asylum, Carter reported being awakened by sounds that he could not identify. His letter describes hearing metallic scraping, muffled screaming, and what might have been the sounds of surgical procedures coming from somewhere below his guest quarters. The sounds persisted for several hours, accompanied by the movement of people and equipment. When he mentioned these sounds to Harris the following morning, the superintendent dismissed them as the result of the heating system's expansion and contraction. Carter noted that Harris appeared nervous and eager to conclude the visit, rushing him through breakfast and insisting that his carriage was waiting to take him back to Charleston. The most disturbing aspect of Carter's visit came during his examination of the asylum's medical records. Harris had proudly shown him the institution's low mortality rates and detailed treatment records, but Carter noticed significant gaps in the documentation. Certain patient files were missing entirely, and others contained references to treatments that Carter did not recognize. When he asked about these discrepancies, Harris became defensive, claiming that some records were confidential due to the patients' prominent families. Carter found this explanation unconvincing, noting that confidentiality had never prevented him from reviewing medical records at other institutions. Carter's suspicions were further aroused by his interactions with the nursing staff. Ruth Palmer, in particular, seemed distressed whenever Harris was present, and her responses to Carter's questions were notably guarded. During one brief conversation when Harris was absent, Palmer had begun to say something about the special patients in the lower ward before catching herself and changing the subject. Carter pressed her for more information, but Palmer claimed she had been referring to patients with infectious diseases and refused to elaborate further. Carter's letter to Coleman concluded with his recommendation that the South Carolina Medical Society conduct a formal inquiry into the asylum's practices. He wrote that while he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, the combination of Harris's secretive behavior, the staff's nervousness, the gaps in medical records, and the disturbing nighttime sounds suggested that the institution might not be operating in accordance with accepted medical standards. Coleman, however, was reluctant to pursue the matter, noting that Harris's reputation made accusations against him professionally dangerous. The response to Carter's concerns proved typical of the pattern that would emerge throughout 1837. Whenever questions arose about the asylum's operations, Harris's reputation and political connections ensured that inquiries were quietly discouraged. The Georgia Medical Society, which had honored Harris with its presidency, had no interest in investigating one of its most prominent members. State officials, who had praised the asylum as a model institution, were similarly reluctant to pursue allegations that might reflect poorly on their judgment. A more direct challenge to Harris's authority came from an unexpected source, Margaret Wells, a seamstress who had been contracted to provide clothing for the asylum's patients. Wells, who had been sewing for the institution since its opening, noticed a disturbing change in the types of garments she was being asked to produce. In addition to the standard patient uniforms, Harris had requested several sets of unusually small clothing, sized for children much younger than the asylum's typical patient population. When Wells asked about the purpose of these garments, Harris explained that the asylum was expanding its services to include treatment of juvenile patients. Wells found this explanation puzzling, as she had never seen children at the asylum during her regular visits to deliver completed work. More concerning was Harris's specific requirement that the children's clothing be easily removable, with breakaway seams and minimal fasteners. When Wells questioned this unusual design, Harris claimed it was necessary for patients who might become violent or attempt self-harm, though he seemed uncomfortable providing this explanation. Wells's suspicions deepened when she observed Harris's reaction to her questions. The superintendent, normally composed and articulate, seemed flustered and eager to end their conversation. He quickly agreed to her pricing without the usual negotiation and insisted that the work be completed as quickly as possible. Wells noted that Harris seemed particularly anxious about maintaining secrecy regarding the children's clothing, repeatedly emphasizing that the asylum's work with juvenile patients was experimental and not to be discussed with outsiders. The seamstress's concerns were reinforced by her observations during subsequent visits to the asylum. She noticed that certain areas of the building were now off-limits to contractors, and that Harris's staff seemed more guarded in their interactions with outside visitors. The atmosphere at the asylum had changed, becoming more secretive and tense. Wells described feeling watched during her visits, as if Harris and his staff were monitoring her movements and conversations to ensure she didn't discover something she shouldn't see. Wells eventually shared her concerns with her minister, Reverend Walter Green of Savannah's First Presbyterian Church. Green, who had previously supported the asylum's mission, was troubled by Wells's report, but uncertain how to proceed. He considered raising the matter with the asylum's board of trustees, several of whom were members of his congregation, but hesitated to make accusations based on what might be innocent circumstances. Green's internal struggle, documented in his private journals, reflects the broader community's reluctance to question an institution that had brought prestige to their city. The pattern of ignored warnings continued throughout the spring and summer of 1837. Minor incidents and troubling observations accumulated, but Harris's reputation and the asylum's public image prevented serious investigation. The few individuals who expressed concerns were dismissed as troublemakers or told to mind their own business. The systematic suppression of questions about the asylum's operations created an environment where Harris could pursue his research without interference. Meanwhile, Ruth Palmer's secret documentation of Harris's activities was reaching a critical phase. Her diaries from this period show her growing horror at the twins' treatment and her desperate attempts to find someone in authority who might listen to her concerns. Palmer had tried to approach Dr. Baker and Dr. Collins, but both physicians were clearly complicit in Harris's research. Her attempts to contact the Board of Trustees were blocked by Harris's control over institutional communications. Palmer found herself trapped, possessing evidence of horrific crimes but unable to find anyone willing to listen or act on her information. By August 1837, the Georgia State Asylum for the Insane had successfully maintained its public facade, while concealing activities that would have horrified the community that supported it. The Albino twins, who had arrived 6 months earlier, had become the subjects of Harris's most intensive research. Their deteriorating condition, hidden from outside observers but meticulously documented in Palmer's secret diaries, represented the culmination of Harris's descent into scientific barbarism. The warnings had been there, but the community's faith in the institution and its leadership had prevented anyone from taking decisive action to investigate the truth. The systematic exposure of Harris's crimes began in September 1837, when a series of connected discoveries finally broke through the wall of silence that had protected the asylum. The first breakthrough came from Henry Wallace, a maintenance worker employed by the institution, who stumbled upon Harris's basement laboratory while repairing a water pipe. Wallace, who had worked at the asylum for 3 years without incident, had been sent to investigate a leak in the building's foundation that was threatening the structural integrity of the main floor. Wallace's route to the leak took him through areas of the basement that were normally restricted, but the urgency of the repair work had prompted Harris to grant him access. What Wallace discovered in the basement laboratory was documented in a sworn statement he gave to Sheriff John Thompson 2 days later. According to Wallace's account, he had entered the basement laboratory through a service corridor and immediately encountered sights that defied rational explanation. The room contained 6 cells, each equipped with observation windows and medical equipment. In 2 of the cells, Wallace observed what he described as 2 pale children barely alive, with their bodies covered in surgical wounds and scars. The condition of the children, whom Wallace would later learn were the Albino twins, was horrific beyond description. Both appeared severely malnourished, with their already pale skin taking on a translucent quality that made their veins clearly visible beneath the surface. Their heads had been partially shaved, revealing surgical scars that suggested ongoing brain surgery. Most disturbing were their eyes, which Wallace described as empty and staring, like they had seen things no child should ever witness. The twins appeared to be conscious, but unresponsive, lying motionless on thin mattresses in their respective cells, their breathing shallow and labored. Wallace's statement detailed the presence of extensive medical equipment in the laboratory, including surgical instruments, preservation jars, and detailed anatomical charts. The walls were covered with photographs and drawings of the twins, documenting the progression of their physical deterioration over the months they had been held captive. Tables contained notebooks filled with Harris's observations, written in a clinical style that treated the children as laboratory specimens rather than human beings. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of preserved organs and tissue samples stored in glass jars that lined one wall of the laboratory, with labels indicating they had been removed from the twins during various surgical procedures. Sheriff Thompson's initial response to Wallace's report was to order the maintenance worker to remain silent while he conducted what he termed a preliminary investigation. Thompson's investigation, however, consisted primarily of meeting with Harris to discuss the allegations. The sheriff's willingness to accept Harris's explanations without conducting a thorough examination of the basement laboratory suggests that Thompson may have been compromised by his previous relationship with the superintendent. Harris apparently convinced Thompson that Wallace had misinterpreted medical equipment and procedures, and that the asylum was operating within accepted medical standards. Wallace, however, had confided in his wife, Anna Gilbert, before giving his statement to the sheriff. Gilbert, horrified by her husband's account, refused to remain silent despite Thompson's orders. She shared the information with her sister, Marie Douglas, who worked as a seamstress for several prominent Savannah families. Douglas, recognizing the significance of the allegations, discussed the matter with her employer, Mrs. Elizabeth Dixon, wife of Walter Dixon, a wealthy merchant and member of the asylum's board of trustees. Mrs. Dixon's response to the report was immediate and decisive. She confronted her husband with the allegations and demanded that he investigate the situation personally, threatening to take the matter to other board members if he refused to act. Walter Dixon, who had previously regarded Harris as a model superintendent, was initially skeptical of the claims. However, his wife's insistence and the detailed nature of Wallace's account convinced him that the allegations required serious investigation. Dixon's decision to conduct his own examination of the asylum's basement facilities would prove to be the breakthrough that finally exposed Harris's crimes. Dixon's unannounced visit to the asylum in late September 1837 caught Harris completely unprepared. The superintendent attempted to deny Dixon access to the basement laboratory, claiming that confidential medical procedures were in progress and that interruption could endanger patient safety. Dixon, however, invoked his authority as a board member and insisted on a complete inspection of the facilities. When Harris continued to resist, Dixon threatened to return with the other trustees and demanded immediate access to all areas of the institution. Harris's capitulation marked the beginning of the end for his research program. Dixon's inspection of the basement laboratory, conducted in Harris's reluctant presence, revealed the full scope of the superintendent's crimes. Dixon's subsequent report to the full Board of Trustees, preserved in the asylum's administrative records, provides the most detailed account of the laboratory's contents and the condition of the twins. According to Dixon's report, the twins were in the final stages of Harris's research program, their bodies bearing the evidence of months of surgical experimentation that had left them barely alive. The boy, identified in Harris's notes as Subject A, had undergone extensive brain surgery that had left him in a vegetative state. His skull showed evidence of multiple surgical interventions, with portions of his brain tissue removed for study. The girl, Subject B, had been subjected to repeated organ biopsies and tissue sampling that had compromised her vital functions. Both children were clearly dying, their bodies unable to withstand the trauma of Harris's ongoing experiments. Dixon noted that the twins appeared to be in constant pain, their breathing labored, and their responses to stimuli minimal. Dixon's report also documented the extensive records that Harris had maintained throughout his research program. The superintendent had photographed every stage of the twins' deterioration, creating a comprehensive visual record of their decline that filled multiple albums. His notes revealed that the children had been acquired through a network of contacts who provided subjects for medical research, with their true identities deliberately obscured to maintain what Harris termed scientific objectivity. The twins' real names, origins, and the circumstances of their acquisition remained unknown, as Harris had systematically avoided learning any personal details about his subjects. The discovery of Ruth Palmer's secret diaries during Dixon's inspection provided crucial corroborating evidence of Harris's crimes. Palmer had hidden her detailed records in her private quarters, documenting not only her observations of the twins' treatment, but also her attempts to find someone in authority who would listen to her concerns. Her diaries revealed that the twins had been subjected to surgical procedures without anesthesia, their screams muffled by the basement's stone walls and the building's isolation. Palmer had recorded dates, times, and detailed descriptions of Harris's experiments, creating a contemporary record that would prove invaluable in establishing the scope of his crimes. Palmer's documentation also revealed that Harris's experiments had extended beyond simple observation and tissue sampling. The superintendent had been conducting what he termed controlled deterioration studies, systematically damaging the twins' organs and nervous systems to observe the progression of various pathological conditions. His research notes, written in clinical language that completely dehumanized his subjects, described the twins as excellent specimens whose albinism provided unique opportunities for studying physiological abnormalities under controlled conditions. The Board of Trustees' response to Dixon's report was swift but secretive. Rather than reporting Harris's crimes to civil authorities, they chose to handle the matter internally to avoid scandal. The asylum's reputation, their own professional standing, and the institution's financial viability were all at stake. They feared that public exposure would not only destroy the asylum, but also implicate them in Harris's crimes through their failure to provide adequate oversight. The board's decision to prioritize institutional preservation over justice would prove to be a crucial factor in enabling Harris to escape legal accountability for his actions. Harris's reaction to the board's discovery of his research was to begin immediately destroying evidence while negotiating the terms of his departure. He spent the night following Dixon's inspection, burning documents, disposing of equipment, and attempting to eliminate any trace of his experiments. The twins, who had been the subjects of his most intensive research, died during this period. Palmer's diary suggests that Harris may have administered lethal doses of medication to prevent the children from surviving as witnesses to his crimes. Their bodies were cremated in the asylum's furnace before dawn, eliminating any possibility of future medical examination or legal evidence. The board's final confrontation with Harris, held in early October 1837, established the terms of his departure and the cover-up that would follow. Harris agreed to leave Georgia immediately and never return, while the board agreed to provide him with letters of recommendation that would allow him to continue his medical career elsewhere. The basement laboratory was to be sealed and renovated, its contents destroyed or removed. The official records were to be altered to eliminate any reference to the twins or Harris's research program. In exchange for these concessions, Harris agreed to surrender all his research materials and submit to permanent exile from Georgia. Ruth Palmer, whose courage in documenting Harris's crimes had provided crucial evidence, found herself in an impossible position. The board recognized that her testimony could destroy their cover-up, but they also understood that her moral convictions made her unlikely to cooperate voluntarily. Palmer was dismissed from her position and warned that any attempt to speak publicly about the asylum's activities would result in criminal charges for theft of confidential medical records. Her secret diaries were confiscated, though she had managed to hide copies that would not be discovered for decades. The suppression of Wallace's testimony proved equally systematic. Sheriff Thompson, acting on instructions from influential board members, reopened the case against Wallace and filed formal charges of theft and trespassing. Though the charges were eventually dropped, Wallace's reputation was destroyed, and he was forced to leave Savannah. His wife, Anna Gilbert, faced similar harassment and economic pressure, ensuring that the couple would be unable to pursue the matter further. Their subsequent relocation to Alabama removed them from the jurisdiction where their testimony might have proven damaging to the cover-up. The immediate aftermath of Harris's departure from the Georgia State Asylum was marked by a carefully orchestrated campaign to erase all evidence of his crimes. The Board of Trustees, led by Walter Dixon, implemented what they termed institutional rehabilitation, but which amounted to a systematic destruction of evidence and intimidation of witnesses. Within 3 months of Harris's resignation, virtually every trace of his research program had been eliminated from the asylum's records, and the few individuals who possessed knowledge of his crimes had been silenced or driven away. The basement laboratory was completely renovated under the supervision of contractors brought in from Atlanta, specifically for their distance from Savannah's social networks. The stone walls were whitewashed, the cells were converted into storage rooms for medical supplies, and the specialized equipment that Harris had used for his experiments was removed and destroyed. The preservation jars containing tissue samples from the twins were incinerated in the asylum's furnace, along with Harris's extensive photographic documentation of their deterioration. The contractors were sworn to secrecy and paid premium wages for their discretion, ensuring that no details of the laboratory's previous use would emerge from their work. Dr. Arthur Newman, Harris's replacement as superintendent, was chosen as much for his willingness to maintain silence as for his medical credentials. Newman, who had previously served as an assistant physician at a Philadelphia asylum, was explicitly told that his appointment was contingent on his agreement never to discuss or investigate his predecessor's activities. The board provided Newman with a sanitized version of the asylum's history that made no mention of the basement laboratory or the twins' fate. Newman's subsequent management of the institution focused on conventional psychiatric treatment and the restoration of the asylum's reputation. Ruth Palmer's fate exemplified the board's systematic approach to silencing witnesses. Dismissed from her position without explanation, Palmer found herself blacklisted from nursing positions throughout Georgia. Her attempts to find employment were thwarted by negative references from the asylum's board, who characterized her as unreliable and prone to fabricating stories. The confiscation of her diaries had eliminated her documentary evidence, though she had managed to hide complete copies in the lining of her personal trunk before her dismissal. Palmer eventually left Georgia entirely, settling in North Carolina where she worked as a seamstress and maintained absolute silence about her experiences at the asylum. Her hidden diaries sewn into her trunk's lining remained undiscovered until 1923, when Palmer's death led to the sale of her possessions. The purchaser of her trunk, a furniture dealer named Robert Anderson, discovered the diaries while repairing the damaged lining. Anderson, recognizing their historical significance, preserved the documents but was unable to verify their authenticity or find anyone willing to investigate their claims. Henry Wallace and his wife Anna Gilbert faced equally systematic persecution. Sheriff Thompson's prosecution of Wallace on theft and trespassing charges, though ultimately unsuccessful, destroyed Wallace's reputation and employment prospects in Savannah. The couple was forced to relocate to Alabama, where Wallace found work in a textile mill. His health, already compromised by the stress of his discovery and subsequent persecution, deteriorated rapidly in the harsh industrial environment. Wallace died in 1841 from injuries sustained in what was officially ruled a workplace accident, though circumstances suggested the possibility of foul play. Anna Gilbert survived her husband by several years, but maintained absolute silence about their experiences in Savannah. Her attempts to contact authorities in Alabama about Harris's crimes were dismissed by officials who regarded her claims as the fantasies of a grieving widow. Gilbert's isolation and poverty prevented her from pursuing the matter further, and she died in 1847 without ever seeing justice for the crimes she had helped to expose. The other witnesses to Harris's crimes were silenced through a combination of intimidation and economic pressure. Margaret Wells, the seamstress who had questioned the unusual clothing orders, found her contract with the asylum terminated and her other customers pressured to cease doing business with her. Dr. Joseph Carter, the visiting physician who had reported his concerns to colleagues, received a letter from the Georgia Medical Society questioning his professional judgment and warning him against spreading unfounded rumors about respected institutions. Frank Reynolds, the delivery boy who had first reported hearing children's cries, was dismissed from his employment and found work only in distant cities where his story was unknown. Harris himself had vanished completely from Georgia by November 1837, leaving behind only the carefully maintained fiction of his resignation for health reasons. The board's provision of positive references enabled him to continue his medical career, though under what circumstances and with what consequences remained unknown. Occasional rumors surfaced over the following decades, placing Harris in various locations throughout the South and Midwest, but his ultimate fate was never determined. The possibility that he continued his research elsewhere, protected by the conspiracy of silence that had enabled his escape from justice, remained a disturbing likelihood. The twins, whose suffering had been documented in such horrific detail, were erased from history as completely as if they had never existed. Their names, origins, and the circumstances of their arrival at the asylum were purged from all records. The cells where they had been held were renovated beyond recognition, and their remains were destroyed so thoroughly that no trace survived. Even their burial, if it could be called that, was denied them, their bodies reduced to ash and scattered without ceremony or acknowledgement of their humanity. The success of the cover-up was so complete that within a year of Harris's departure, the Georgia State Asylum had not only resumed its reputation as a model institution, but had actually enhanced its standing in the medical community. Dr. Newman's conventional approach to psychiatric treatment attracted praise from visiting physicians, and the asylum's patient mortality rates improved dramatically. The board took credit for these improvements, portraying the transition as evidence of their commitment to excellence in patient care, while never acknowledging the horrors that had necessitated Harris's removal. The asylum's annual reports to the state legislature, beginning in 1838, made no mention of the previous year's upheaval. Instead, they focused on the institution's achievements under Newman's leadership and its continued service to Georgia's mentally ill population. The reports praised the asylum's modern facilities and humane treatment methods, creating a narrative that completely obscured the crimes that had occurred beneath the building's main floors. The effectiveness of this revision of history was demonstrated when no questions were raised about the dramatic changes in asylum management or the mysterious disappearance of Harris from Georgia's medical community. The few individuals who possessed knowledge of Harris's crimes found themselves increasingly isolated and powerless as the years passed. Reverend Walter Green, who had been consulted by Margaret Wells about her suspicions, received subtle but clear warnings from prominent parishioners to avoid discussing the asylum's affairs. Green's subsequent sermons avoided any reference to institutional responsibility or the protection of vulnerable populations, suggesting that even religious leaders were not immune to the pressure to maintain silence about inconvenient truths. The effectiveness of the cover-up was dramatically demonstrated in 1839 when a delegation of physicians from the American Medical Association visited the asylum as part of a national survey of psychiatric facilities. The delegation's report, published in the American Journal of Insanity, praised the Georgia Asylum as one of the finest institutions in the South. They noted the facility's excellent patient care, low mortality rates, and progressive treatment methods, concluding that it served as a model for other states seeking to improve their own psychiatric institutions. The delegation had no awareness that they were examining a facility that had been the site of systematic medical murder less than 2 years earlier. As decades passed, the memory of Harris's crimes faded from public consciousness, preserved only in the scattered recollections of witnesses who had been effectively silenced and in Ruth Palmer's hidden diaries. The asylum continued to operate as a respected institution, its reputation unmarked by the horrors that had occurred within its walls. New staff members joined the institution with no knowledge of its dark history, and new patients were treated by physicians who had never heard of the basement laboratory or the twins who had died there. The Georgia State Asylum's success in covering up Harris's crimes became a template for institutional self-protection that would be replicated at other facilities throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The pattern of internal investigation, witness intimidation, and evidence destruction would be employed repeatedly whenever scandals threatened to expose institutional wrongdoing. The asylum's board had demonstrated that even the most horrific crimes could be concealed with sufficient resources, determination, and the cooperation of local authorities. The twins' story, which should have served as a warning about the dangers of unchecked institutional power, instead became a cautionary tale about the effectiveness of systematic cover-ups. Their suffering, documented in such clinical detail by their tormentor and witnessed by brave individuals like Ruth Palmer, was erased from history as completely as their names and identities. They had been denied not only justice but memory, their existence acknowledged only in the private guilt of those who had participated in or witnessed their destruction. The Georgia State Asylum for the Insane continued to operate until 1965, when it was finally closed as part of the nationwide deinstitutionalization movement. During its 128-year history following Harris's departure, the asylum treated thousands of patients and earned numerous commendations for its progressive approach to mental health care. The building itself was demolished in 1970, its basement laboratory destroyed along with the rest of the structure. Whatever physical evidence might have remained of Harris's crimes was buried beneath the modern apartment complex that replaced the asylum on the Savannah site. The twins' story might have remained forever buried if not for the accidental discovery of Ruth Palmer's hidden diaries in 1923. The furniture dealer who purchased Palmer's trunk, Robert Anderson, initially doubted the authenticity of the documents, but was eventually convinced by their internal consistency and detailed knowledge of 19th-century medical practices. Anderson spent years attempting to verify the diary's claims, but the passage of time and the thoroughness of the original cover-up made confirmation impossible. Anderson's efforts to interest authorities in investigating Palmer's claims were unsuccessful, as the statute of limitations had long since expired and all the principals were dead. The Georgia state government showed no interest in reopening a case that would reflect poorly on one of its former flagship institutions. Anderson eventually donated Palmer's diaries to the Georgia Historical Society, where they were filed away and largely forgotten until researchers began examining institutional abuse in the 1970s. The discovery of Palmer's diaries in the Historical Society's archives prompted a brief academic study of the asylum's history, but the passage of nearly 140 years had eliminated any possibility of meaningful accountability. The study's findings, published in a limited circulation historical journal in 1976, attracted little attention outside of academic circles specializing in medical history. The researchers concluded that while serious crimes had apparently been committed at the asylum, the destruction of evidence and the death of witnesses made any definitive conclusions impossible. Today, the site of the Georgia State Asylum for the Insane is occupied by a modern apartment complex called Magnolia Gardens, its residents unaware of the horrors that once occurred beneath their feet. No memorial marks the location of the basement laboratory where the twins suffered and died, and no historical marker acknowledges their existence. The apartment complex's marketing materials emphasize the peaceful tree-lined setting and the area's rich historical heritage, making no mention of the institution that once dominated the landscape. The albino twins of the Georgia State Asylum remain nameless and forgotten, their suffering reduced to footnotes in academic studies of institutional abuse. Their story serves as a reminder that even the most respected institutions can harbor unspeakable horrors, and that the absence of accountability can enable the systematic destruction of human dignity. The twins were denied not only justice and medical care, but even the basic recognition of their humanity, treated as specimens rather than children, subjects rather than victims. Ruth Palmer's courage in documenting their suffering provides the only voice these children ever had in history. Her secret diaries, hidden for decades in the lining of a trunk, represent one woman's determination to bear witness to crimes that powerful men sought to erase. Palmer paid dearly for her moral conviction, losing her career, her home, and her security, but her documentation ensured that the twins' story would eventually emerge from the darkness that had consumed them. The systematic cover-up that followed Harris's departure demonstrates the terrifying efficiency with which institutions can protect themselves when their survival is threatened. Every witness was silenced, every document destroyed, every trace of evidence eliminated through the coordinated efforts of respected community leaders who valued reputation above justice. The twins' erasure from history was so complete that their story survived only through the hidden writings of a nurse who risked everything to document the truth. Dr. William Harris himself disappeared into the anonymity he had created for his victims, protected by the conspiracy of silence that enabled his escape. The possibility that he continued his research elsewhere, armed with the knowledge gained from his experiments on the twins, remains a disturbing likelihood that will never be resolved. His techniques for acquiring subjects, conducting experiments, and avoiding detection were perfected at the Georgia Asylum and may have been replicated at other institutions where his reputation could secure him positions of authority. The twins' legacy exists not in monuments or memorials, but in the questions their story raises about institutional power and the protection of vulnerable populations. Their deaths occurred not in some distant, uncivilized place, but in one of America's most progressive medical institutions, under the supervision of respected physicians, with the knowledge of community leaders who chose silence over justice. Their story demonstrates that medical barbarism can flourish even in the most unlikely settings when accountability is absent and moral courage is rare. In the end, the albino twins of the Georgia State Asylum represent the countless unnamed victims of institutional abuse whose stories were successfully buried by those with the power to rewrite history. They serve as a reminder that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that silence in the face of atrocity becomes complicity in its perpetuation. Their only memorial is the truth that finally emerged from Ruth Palmer's hidden diaries, a truth that arrived too late for justice, but not too late for memory. The twins remain forever frozen in the clinical photographs Harris took of their deterioration, their pale faces staring out from images that were meant to document scientific progress, but instead recorded the systematic destruction of innocence. They were children whose names we will never know, whose families we cannot trace, whose graves do not exist, but whose suffering was real, whose pain was documented, and whose story demands to be remembered as a warning about the darkness that can hide behind the facade of respectability. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.